pick up where we left off, Job chapter 10, verse 13, and we'll move into, Zophar's going to weigh in tonight, but we're not going to get all the way through what he has to say. Job chapter 10, we're just going to read chapter 10, and when we finish that up, we'll read chapter 11. And these things hast thou hid in thine heart. I know that this is with thee. If I sin, then thou markest me, and thou wilt not acquit me from mine iniquity. If I be wicked, woe unto me. And if I be righteous, yet will I not lift up my head. I am full of confusion, therefore see thou mine affliction. For it increaseth. Thou huntest me as a fierce lion, and again thou showest thyself marvelous upon me. Thou renewest thy witnesses against me, and increasest thine indignation upon me. Changes and war are against me. Wherefore then hast thou brought me forth out of the womb? O that I had given up the ghost, and no eye had seen me. I should have been as though I had not been. I should have been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Cease then, and let me alone, that I may take comfort a little. Before I go, whence I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and the shadow of death. A land of darkness as darkness itself, and of the shadow of death without any order, and where the light is as darkness. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, as we get back into this study of Job, it is a reminder that sometimes life is difficult. And one of the toughest things sometimes for us is to feel out of control and to not know why. And some of the toughest times in Job's life are those times when you are silent and he is desperately wanting to hear from you. But just because we don't hear from you doesn't mean that you aren't there and that you no longer care. It is important that we understand how needful it is to encourage, to edify, to bolster each other. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. He started off this chapter. This is Job talking to God. He already answered his buddy Eliphaz. Now he's going to talk to God in chapter 10. And in verses 1 through 7, he feels condemned without charges. One of the difficult things for us as people is to feel like we don't like it. Here's a phrase: taxation with no representation. Felt like that was a problem at the Revolutionary War, right? When we want to be heard, we want to feel like we have some input. We want to understand what the situation here is because we like to have some control. And then you have, it's illegal to hold somebody longer than a certain number of hours unless you charge them. In other words, you can't throw somebody in prison, just leave them there for months and months and months, and they have no idea why. You have to tell them what they're being charged for, and then in a reasonable amount of time, they have the right to come before the court and be heard, and innocent until proven guilty. And so you combine those three thoughts. We like to have some control, and we want to be heard, and we certainly want to know if somebody thinks we're guilty of something, why we're guilty of it. And so the first 7 verses here is Job crying out because he's feeling the burden of that. He feels like he is being condemned, and he doesn't understand what the charges are. And then in verses 8 through 12, he was saying, I am your creation. You took the time to create me, and you made me in such a magnificent and incredible way. So why are you dealing with me in this way now? It just seems contrary. And now we get to the end of the chapter here, and we're going to look in verses 13 through 17 at God's intolerance of sin. And it starts off here with a difficult verse in 13. This is poetry in the original language, and so sometimes when they're translating it, I've got probably, 9 or 10 commentaries, something like that I've been looking through and reading. And so many of them get bogged down in this tense form of such and such reflects on, and you can spend hours as they try to dissect what's happening here. But the reason that 13 is difficult to understand is because a lot of people think he is talking about verse 12, and just as many people think he's talking about verse 14. So let's look at it. These things is, if it is about to be what he's listing here in verse 14, if I sin, then thou markest me and will not acquit me from mine iniquity. What he's saying here is, on the basis that the fact that God is all-knowing, he knows everything about my life and the choices I'm going to make and the things that I'm going to do, then you knew that this evil was going to come. And so he describes it as saying you hid it in your heart. You knew it, but you didn't make it known. And so here I am going along living my life under your blessing, and felt like we have a great relationship together, and this thing was hidden from me until all of a sudden on that fateful day, everything broke loose. And the word is similar to what's used in Luke chapter 2, verse 51. Folks start showing up to see the newborn baby, and an angel came to us and said, and wise men are coming to visit, and we followed his thing from afar. And over again in the early life of Jesus, this statement comes out that Mary makes. She hid these things in her heart. And that's kind of the idea that Job is saying here. If you look at verse 14, you knew this was coming, but you hid it in your heart. You held that information to yourself until it was applicable at some future time period. And that's what Mary was doing. You know, shepherds come and they give her information, and she hid that saying in her heart. She didn't run around talking it over with a bunch of folks. She just held on to it, and then later on, oh yeah, that all makes sense now, all those years ago when. These things, if it refers back to verse 12, then Job is saying, you remember all the good that you blessed me with, despite all of the evil that's happening lately. And it feels like you've hid that part of my life in your heart, and all you can think about now is how I'm being persecuted in this trial that I'm going through. So then the prayer of his heart will be, will you undo in judgment all that you did in blessing me? Because it feels like that's exactly what's happening. For much of my life, you were building me up and you were working for this end result, and now it seems like you're doing the opposite and tearing all that back down again. Kind of makes you wonder why. And then the implication, of course, would be, when are you going to choose to do more good, and when are you going to speedily deliver from me? That hidden part, when does it come back out? And that's the kind of relationship that we have once again. Now, what's interesting here is both of these ideas recognize that God is all-knowing. Both of these ideas recognize that he has secret counsel that he doesn't make known to the affairs of men. And so either way you look at it, if you're reflecting back on verse 12 or you're looking forward to verse 14, both of those principles come out of both of those verses, because God doesn't always tell us everything. We don't need to know everything. And when we get to the good stuff at the end of the book, there's chapter after chapter after chapter where God talks about how wise he is in doing all these things and revealing himself through nature to Job. But you'll notice that he still doesn't tell him why, and he still doesn't reveal all the counsel. He doesn't say, oh yeah, by the way, Job, I'm getting ready to bless you twice as much as you were before because you passed the test and I, had this conversation with Satan. Job doesn't know any of that. Far as we know, he goes to the grave and he doesn't know any of that. And the point is, he doesn't need to know any of that. Our response to him and our faithfulness to him and our relationship with him isn't predicated upon us knowing all of the things that God knows. When you have done so many wonderful things for me, why are you treating me like an enemy now? That is a question that Job has brought up several times now in the last couple of chapters. But I want you to see approach to sin here. Because Job, nothing is hidden from God. In Revelation chapter 2, well, let's turn there real quickly and take a minute. Romans 8, 26 and 27 deals with it also, but I want you to go to Revelation chapter 2. He is writing to the churches at Thyatira to understand. Starting in verse 18, we'll read down through verse 23. And under and his feet are like fine brass. Both of those pictures are pictures of judgment. The consuming fire that reveals everything the way it is, and the brass that stamps stuff into dust. Verse 19, I know thy works, and charity, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication, to eat things sacrificed unto idols. And I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. And I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and the hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. The point that Job is making here is, if I sin, there's no way. You can't hide something from God. And you get all the way to the end of the book of the Bible in Revelation chapter 2, and that's the way God presents himself to the church of Thyatira. Listen, I know what's going on here, and I know you got some stuff going on in your church. You should have been marking this, throwing them out, withdrawing from these folks. I know your reins and your thoughts. There is nothing that you can hide from me, is the point that he is making. Now, Job also is saying in here, if I sin, you take an account. If you are taking an account of something, we have a whole career, I guess you would call it, accounting. What is their job? They mark down what comes in, they mark down what goes out, and their job is to make sure what? Every last little penny is accounted for. Okay? That's the term. And that's what Job is saying here. If I sin, you take account. And this is a good word because he's saying you understand it entirely. I might not understand when somebody sins. I might not know how bad it is or what all was involved. But you understand it absolutely, completely, entirely. You know how bad it was, the whole thing. And you record it accurately. In Revelation 20:12, when they are doing the judgment, it says, the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And so they go to the book of life, and they find out if your name is in there. And if your name is not in the book of life, then that book is over here. Okay, so let's go to the books. What are the books? This is what it is. Job's saying, if I sin, you account for it. And it says they were judged out of the books by their works. And the third thing that he's saying here, number one, you don't hide anything from God. Number two, he accurately knows what it is and records it so that when judgment day comes, you are properly going to be held accountable for it. And then the third thing is, you will not consider me innocent if I am guilty. What an incredible statement. You are not going to acquit me of something when you know that I am guilty. It is not in your character to do so. But then look at his approach in verse 15. My approach to judgment. If I be wicked, woe unto me. Well, that's a good place to start. If I am an ungodly hypocrite, Job is saying, like my friends keep saying that I am, and in just a minute the third guy's going to weigh in, and guess what he says too? There's no reason to expect anything but misery, because I deserve it. That's what Job is saying here. He says, if I be wicked, if I am a hypocrite, then I deserve all of this misery and more.
But I want you to know, fellas, it's against God's nature to look away or ignore sin. But just because somebody is having a hard time still doesn't necessarily mean that it's because of sin, because Job is maintaining his righteousness. Look what he says. And if I be righteous, if I am an upright and just, if I am not a hypocrite, fellas, yet will I not lift up my head. That is a statement that is used in the Old Testament that talks about someone having no confidence or no hope. It's a sign of shame. So what he's saying here is, and he's talking to God, he's saying, these guys keep accusing me of being a hypocrite, and even if I'm innocent, I cannot lift up my head in their presence, because to them, all the evidence leads to the contrary. And so that's why he's wishing God would weigh in on the argument. It seems like from them, because all they can think about is the fact that, well, if you sin, God's going to judge you. And because God is judging you harshly, then, Job, you must have sinned. And because this keeps going on and on and on and on, wow, this has to be a whole lot worse than we ever thought it was. And we're going to see that Zophar is going to jump in here a little bit, and that's exactly what he's going to say. But notice, at the end of this verse, I am full of confusion, therefore see thou mine affliction. When we think of confusion, we think of can't remember this or didn't remember that. The word literally means to be full of disgrace, reproach, or shame. That's what it means. And so, if you think about it, Job is in a place where all of his hopes and dreams and desires have been disappointed, right? There isn't an area of his life that hasn't been touched while he's sitting on the ash heap. And he's in misery. And so that's not the way he wants to spend all of his days. And then his three friends show up, and he thinks that he's going to get some encouragement and some advice and some, at least some camaraderie. And these old boys start piling on him. And so now he's bearing the contempt of his friends also. And it just seems like every way he turns, he is confused or confounded or disregarded. And to make it all really bad for Job, the silence of God, despite the fact that he has cried out multiple times for relief. I wish you'd show up in court. I wish you'd come down and talk to me. I wish you'd weigh in on this. I wish you'd at least tell me what I've done wrong so that I can repent of it. There isn't an answer from God. But the end of verse 15 is a little confusing in the English. It's actually the same root word in the Hebrew with two variants of it. So what he says here is, therefore see thou mine affliction. We think that he's asking God to look on his affliction, and that's not what's happening. Job is literally saying, therefore seeing I see my affliction. In other words, when I look at what's happening to me, it seems to me that I'm guilty, and yet I don't know of any sin in my life. I can't think of any way that I have offended you, so I wish you'd show up and let me know. Evidence against me in verses 16 and 17. Now this is from his friends talking, right? Because every time a friend talks, you're in a rough spot, Job, so you must be an awful man. He starts off and says, for it increases. The suffering upon suffering is the idea here, but more the idea that it stretches on. In other words, to his friends, Job must be really guilty of something, or God would have judged him and then it would have been done. But by virtue of the fact that it increases day after day after day, it keeps stretching on and on and on, means there's something still wrong in Job's life, or God would have removed the suffering from him. And so you're going to see when Zophar jumps on him here in a minute, he calls him a windbag and piles on, because they think that Job's misrepresenting himself and God's still dealing harshly with him. The time isn't shortening and the situation isn't improving, so God still must be trying to root out some sin in his life. And then he talks about how he feels here. You hunt me as a fierce lion in verse 16. And again, thou showest thyself marvelous upon me. When a lion hunts, sometimes the male lion will roar and everybody pays attention to the male lion, a little realizing that it's the girls you got to be worried about. Because the lionesses are much sleeker and faster than the lazy fat males. And they're out, spread out, going through, and he roars and everybody turns around to pay attention to the lion, and then all of a sudden you have this swift, sudden surprise attack from the lionesses. And when they take their prize down, they usually kill it very quickly. They don't monkey around because they don't want it to escape. So they bring it down and there's that sudden surprise pursuit, and then they grab you and bam, it's over with. And he says, I feel like that's what you did to me. There I was on an ordinary day, and I was expecting to be sacrificing with my kids and worshiping, and instead it's almost like the lionesses came, and this one attacked, and this one attacked, and this one attacked, and this one attacked, and then you think it's over, and next thing you know, my health is gone, and then it keeps dragging out. And the second part of the verse is, thou showest thyself marvelous upon me. Doesn't mean he is blessing him. It's the opposite. The trials are adding up. They keep, a lion would kill its prey and then it's over with. But it's almost like partially killed me and then partially killed me and then partially killed me and then partially killed me. And, cat sitting there playing with a mouse. I got you and you can't get away, but you can try. And you'll notice he says, thou renewest thy witnesses against me. In other words, I am repeatedly tormented beyond what I can understand. And the trials come in waves, like he's in a courtroom, remember. He says, if you were calling witnesses to the stand and you'd say, witness number 1, here come the Sabians. Witness number 2, here come the witness number 3, here comes the whirlwind that takes down the kid's house. Witness number, and it says it's like a succession of difficulty that has built up adversity against me, almost like you've called witness after witness after witness. Now let's close out the chapter here with Job's lament here at the end. And we're not going to dig into it because actually a lot of it is reminiscent of chapter 3, and we've already been there. But he starts off 18, 19, and 20. Why don't you kill me? Were better that I had not been born. Chapter 3, I think specifically verse 11, but a couple of verses in there talk about that. And then in verse 20, he says, my life is short. And you can take this either way. I don't have much longer, so is he expecting to die? Or, because he is in such dire straits, is he reflecting on the shortness of life in general and saying, man, life is really short. Do I get a break beforehand? Can I catch a break before I die? Is there any part of this life left that I get to enjoy, or is it just misery until I'm gone? And that's the lament that he has here in 18, 19, and 20. And then he closes 21 and 22. And again, this is poetry. He is just using multiple terms for darkness. He calls it the deepest night and the deep shadow. And he actually uses 4 different Hebrew word variants to describe this deepest night and this deep shadow. But you get an idea of how badly he feels. Because he says, in the middle of verse 22, well, a land of darkness as darkness itself, and of the shadow of death, without any order. Secession would be a good English word for us. In other words, he's saying, we mark the passing of time with day and night, and with seasons. And Job's looking at this situation, and he says, I feel like I am in a land that is just dark. Like everything's dark. Walking dead, might be a good way of describing it. I feel like I'm walking dead. And to me, there isn't any difference between the daylight and the dark. It's all the same suffering to me. And normally you would look forward to the changing of the seasons, but I have no enjoyment from the changing of the seasons, because it doesn't matter if it's summer, I'm hurting, and it doesn't matter if it's fall, I'm hurting, and it doesn't matter if it's winter, I'm hurting, and it doesn't matter if it's spring, I'm hurting. And so what he's saying is, even the simple enjoyments that you have by marking the passing of time, I just see as deep, dark hurt. Every day and night is like the last one, and with nothing really to mark the passing of time. And you say, Job's having a hard time. Zophar's going to come to the rescue. Well, look at the next chapter. You can probably anticipate this good old boy, as Lance likes to call him. Look at verse 1. Then answered Zophar the Nathemite and said, should not the multitude of words be answered, and should a man full of talk be justified? Should thy lies make men hold their peace? That's what he's saying here in verses 1 through 4. He starts off, you're a weighing bag, and we're tired of hearing it. That's what verse 1 and 2 is, just kind of like what his previous friend had said. The amount of talking that you do, Job, doesn't justify you. So you think about it. Chapter 9, he was answering his friend. In chapter 10, he's talking to God. And now his friend's like, well, I'm glad you finally shut up. You've gone on and on and on and on with us, and you've gone on and on and on with God. But I want you to know, brother, that the amount of time you spent talking doesn't justify what's going on here. That's it doesn't make you look any better. Life is proof of your guilt. All you have to do is look around you and know you're guilty, so you can say whatever you want to whomever you want to. To us, to him, doesn't matter, but it's obvious you're guilty, dude. Verse 3 and 4, here's a good old phrase for you. You ready? This is ye old, you're full of baloney. That's what it says. Look at verse 3. Should thy lies make men hold their peace? Lies isn't a good translation here. When you look this word up in most of the rest of the Bible, it's translated bragging or vain boasting, and that's a much better translation. Isaiah 16:6 is a good example of that, where God says, you can brag all you want to, but I'm going to tear you down, brother, because you aren't all that. And that's kind of what Zophar is saying here. He's saying you can brag and you can say that you're innocent and that you're all of this stuff and you're righteous and you're holy and you have this great outlook on God. But basically, should your bragging make a man of sense be quiet? In other words, he's saying, you're arguing with us like you think that we're just going to say, well, yeah, he keeps insisting he's innocent, so he has to be innocent. When anybody can look around at the situation and know from what's going on here, you're as guilty as it gets, Job. Your claim of innocence and godliness is obviously false. And then he uses another term, mockest. Mockest. When thou mockest, shall no man make thee ashamed. In other words, he's saying, you have just sat here. Now, obviously, there's not chapter breaks while they're talking, but for us, in chapter 9, you mocked us by responding to us. And then in chapter 10, you mocked God by challenging him to come to the courtroom and show that you are innocent. You are mocking God and us. Did you think that you wouldn't be found out? Did you think that God was going to let you get away with it? And then he makes some false claims here in verse 4. For thou hast said. Now, you can go back through all of Job's speeches and look. And Job does not claim these two things. He does think that he is clean in God's eyes. But he always says, if not, I wish you'd show me what's wrong so that I can confess it and make it right. False claims. You have pure doctrine. You think you really know God, and you think that you are really innocent, Job. And so what he's going to do is he's going to attack those two.
And he does so in verses 5 through 12 by saying, really, Job, you're ignorant. You think you have such pure doctrine of God and you really know who he is? Well, let me just tell you, you're ignorant, brother. You are ignorant. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee. I wish God would tell us the truth like you've been asking. How many times has God asked Job to show up and say something? And now Zophar is going to throw it back in his face, and he says, if you called him to court and he answered, buddy, I hate to tell it to you, but he'd put you to silence and shame, and there'd be no talking your way out of it. But isn't that what Job said himself? If I called you to court, why should you come? And if you did come, who am I to ask a question of you because you are so high and holy and just? That's what Job said himself. He wasn't haughty about it. He's just saying the impossibility of understanding what God is doing. Look at the first part of verse 6. And that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom. If he were to show you what you really are, Job, in other words, what he's saying is, if he'd really show you what you are that we can't know or see while we're sitting here around this ash heap talking, then it'd be real obvious why you're in the pickle you're in, buddy. You keep trying to talk your way out of it, but if God were to show up and show it, then we would understand. Now he's going to throw in some good doctrine, if you will. This whole section here is interesting because Zophar is going to use some language that when you read it in and of itself, you say, man, that's really good doctrine. In fact, that kind of sounds like Paul writing to the Galatians and the Colossians and the Ephesians, and you would be right because there are some very similar things. So the question is, how can you tell the difference when someone talks between Paul and Zophar? Because there's a world of difference here. And it's in the context. When Paul's talking about God, you can hear he is lifting him up. And when Zophar talks about God, it's because he wants God to show up and start flinging the lightning bolts. God, I know you're higher and better. And so why do we have to listen to this windbag? God, boy, if you really would come down here and answer Job, we'd have us a real show then because we'd find out all the dirty on you. So there's a big difference on what's happening here, but it is good theology. He says, to show thee the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. And it's true. God is so much greater than what we see or what we know or even what he reveals to us. There is so much more to know about God than just what's in here. What's in here is all he wants us to know about him because it's all we need to know about him right now. A great illustration is an iceberg. You roll up on an iceberg in a boat, you better be really careful because the part that you see above the water is only like 10 to 12% of the whole iceberg itself. Most of what the iceberg is what you can't see underneath. And barely grazing the part that's underneath can bring down the Titanic. But look at how he associates these. Job, know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserves. And here's how you know the difference in the theology. God has gone easy on you, buddy. If all the truth were known, you deserve far worse than you're getting right now. And if you're one of his buddies, it'd be hard to look at Job and think that he deserved any worse. I mean, what is there to take away or do to him that hasn't already really been done to him? Goes on and he says, the measure, verse 7, canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? Romans 11:33 tells us that's true, right? And God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and his wisdom is far beyond us. But is Job asking to perfectly know God? Or is Job asking to understand why? Because over and over and over again, when he's questioning God, he's not asking for perfect understanding of who he is. He's asking him to clarify the situation. Why are you dealing with me in such a way? Verse 8, Job, you can't measure the heavens, let alone the Creator that made them. Boy, that's a good thought that'll put you in your place real quick. You think about trying to measure the heavens. Well, that's so many light years away from Earth. How do you measure a light year? I mean, we think we know what a light year is, but what if we're off by 0.5%? Think of how many miles off you would be if you were only off by 0.5% on what a light year is. And that's the thought that's being brought up. Then he's going to go the other way. Deeper than hell, what canst thou know? Hell is far out of your reach. It's far out of your sight. It's far out of your understanding, Job. So really, what do you know, buddy? Now, you can't measure the heavens, and you certainly have no idea what hell is really like. Verse 9, what if you were to measure the earth and the sea? That's incalculable. We say deepest part of the earth is the Marianas Trench, and we think that it's X amount of deep, but we don't have anything that can go down there. Well, then how do you know it's not a whole lot deeper? Verses 10 through 12, as he finishes up, nobody can question his judgment. You can't know him, and you can't question his justice and his judgment. And again, this is really good. If he cut off and shut up or gather together, then who can hinder him? He's too powerful. And Job has already said he's all-powerful God. And then he's going to go into verse 11. For he knoweth vain men, he seeth wickedness also. Will he not then consider it? He's too smart. Not only is he all-powerful, but he's all-knowing. So he can't be deceived. He's not going to miss anything, and he's not going to forget anything, Job. And then the last statement here is in verse 12. For vain man would be wise, though man be born like a wild ass's colt. We are ignorant beasts in comparison. Ecclesiastes 3:18, Psalm 73:22, and Psalm 92:6 all talk about the same thing. The more you understand about God, the more ignorant you are. You might as well go out and my neighbor's field and try and teach that donkey to talk as to try to discover Punk's donkey. I hear it all the time down there. He tries to share his wisdom from time to time, but I don't think anybody's really listening. And that's the whole point here. The more you see how grand and how incredible God is, Job, the more you understand you're just a dumb beast, dude. So recognize it. You're guilty. You're ignorant. So stop trying to justify yourself, because we're not buying it and God isn't buying it either. What's interesting is we get to the end of the book and God's going to say that all three of the friends did not represent me right. So it's interesting because every time a friend has opened up their mouth, they have shared some theology and some doctrine, and some of it sounds pretty good. But when we get to the end, God's upset with them because he says, even though it kind of sounds good here and here, you did not represent me right. You know what made Jesus more upset than anything else here on this earth? The exact same thing. When they perverted worship of the Father. That's why he started his ministry with, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. Because it's so misleading. And if you're off a little bit here, you're off a whole lot out there. Zophar's having that problem.